Hello, everyone. Mark Truss from Wunderman Thompson. Here we are into module 3 about messages. Let me share my screen. Hopefully you can all see that well. A good quote from Leo Burnett, one of the founding fathers of the ad industry. Don't tell me how good you make it. Tell me how good it makes me when I use it. And we've talked about this before, right? About, you can have functional attributes about a product and tell me why the product's great, but you can also, and perhaps more effectively communicate what you're trying to communicate if you talk about the relationship I have with a product and what the product does for me. So let's jump in. I know you've seen this a million times already, but at a very high level, a consumer-centric approach that takes it from objectives and planning to laying out the plan in support of those goals, getting actionable insights, incorporating that into the creative development process, using research to understand your media choices, and then understanding how to measure it. And that this course builds on what you learned in Foundations as well as the other courses in the certificate. And this course in particular is going to give you the ability to justify the role of research throughout this process, recommending approaches, recommending methodologies, integrating insights into this process, and then being able to manage the relationship between stakeholders and communicate what you've learned. So here we are, module 3. So we've talked about a very high level introduction to the advertising and creative process. We've talked about how people process information and make decisions. Now we're going to talk about the message. And coming out of here, we start to get into very advertising specific content, the big idea and a creative brief. So those will be coming up next. So here we are, messages and claims. Yeah. The key message is the thing the advertising needs to communicate. Sounds obvious, right? And that's in order to meet the objective. So the message should express the idea you want consumers to know and remember about your offering, but also about you and their relationship with you. That message should be noticed by and resonate with your target audience, and clearly and concisely state what you want to communicate about your brand, how you're different, why you stand out, what a consumer will get out of using your product, your value, etc., all those kind of things. Sounds easier than it is. It should support your existing brand image and fit well within your big idea and be supported by proof points, what we often refer to as reasons to believe, or RTBs, that we'll talk a little bit more about. There's numerous ways, or what we call in the agency world, numerous angles or ways in to communicating and developing your message, right? So you could talk about the features of your products, the ways of using your product, how, where, or by whom it's made. What does it cost? What's its heritage? Comparison with competitors. New news about your brand. What do people get out of it? Who are the people who use it? The satisfaction of the psychological or physiological needs of the user. Disadvantages of not using it. What is the image of the brand, right? There's a whole long list of ways to do this. You almost can't list them all out. There's too many of them. But these are some of the maybe more prominent ones. This whole idea of persuading people through a message of your argument dates back to ancient Greece, Aristotle, and his thesis on rhetoric. It talks about the 3 ways of making an appeal, what he referred to as ethos. So making an appeal based on authority or credibility. Logos, a logical appeal and pathos and emotional appeal. I always find it fascinating that the industry today is still talking about these same concepts from hundreds of years ago, right? Fascinating. Sometimes a message can be communicated very clearly through a cleverly written slogan, right? I am sure you will know some of these, right? L'Oreal for years, because you're worth it. The New York Times, all the news that's fit to print. Red Bull gives you wings. No one out-pizzas the hut. America runs on Dunkin', right? Classic slogans that often tell you a lot about who they are. You're in good hands with Allstate. Dollar Shave Club, shave time, shave money. The U.S. Marine Corps, the few, the proud, the Marines. Of course, Nike, just do it, right? Clear messages that have been around a long time. And sometimes you don't even need words to do it. Just an image, a well-crafted image can communicate a strong and memorable message. I love the Red Bull one. I mean, I think it's just brilliant. The one on the right is about Mercedes at during the holidays, right? Brilliant. These two are, I think, also just brilliant. The one on the left is for a dating app. Brilliant, like you get it in a second. The one on the right is for a root-based vegetable beverage company. FedEx demonstrating their global service. Colgate, we're talking about the stains on smokers' teeth, right? Again, these are all communicating messages without words, right? So it does sort of beg the question, so are slogans and clever images a message? Well, no. A message is usually much broader than just a slogan, headline, copy, film, product image, whatever. Those are the components of a message and they work together, but they're usually working together to communicate a broader intended message, right? So if we think back to the Colgate one we just looked at, yes, smokers stains their teeth, but the broader message is Colgate's whitening is effective on fixing that problem. The components of a message work together, and they work together not just to deliver a message, but to establish the brand's tone of voice. How does the brand talk to the marketplace? What's their place in the world? What's their point of view? What's the image in the consumer's mind? All of those things which aren't necessarily stated, they're not necessarily written out in the message, but how it is presented tells the consumer all of those things when done well, right? The message is what we want consumers to come away with, what they will internalize in their brain after seeing our brand communication. And that can be different from what we, marketers, agency, researchers, see as the message, right? And that's where research obviously comes in. We think we are intending to say this, but consumers take away that. Nike's Just Do It. We've talked about it a few times in these lectures so far, right? A lot of the Nike imagery is about sports. But Just Do It, as we've talked about a little bit, is really broader than sports. It's about progress, moving forward, not letting obstacles or things get in your way, not feeling like you need to have an athlete's body to be athletic. It's aspirational, inspirational. It cheers you on. It's about accomplishments and what it takes to achieve something, regardless of where the bar is set for you. In their own words, Nike exists to bring inspiration and innovation to every athlete in the world, as we've already discussed. Notice how all of these things are much bigger ideas than a pair of running shoes are actually even using those running shoes. There's a bigger idea here, and everything that Nike does is intended to get at those bigger ideas. Where do messages come from in the creative development process, right? Are they just people sitting around thinking about these things? Sometimes they come from the client's agency brief, their brief to the agency, or from former creative campaigns, or they're developed in strategic brainstorming sessions, or from the agency strategy or creative teams. But usually all of those, I mean, that's literally where they come from, but the source of those almost always originates from research in some way, shape, or form that informed the client's brief or legacy campaigns, etc. What types of research do we do to help generate messages? A lot of different methodologies, right? There's ethnographic, observational, attitude and usage, brand equity, positioning, need state. The list goes on and on and on and on, right? It's almost silly to try and list them. Pretty much any type of research that reveals an insight into consumers, the human condition, or how consumers interact with a brand or what they get out of it, or insights about the product itself that may be motivating to people, are useful in helping generate messages. Let's talk a little bit about testing messages. Once those messages are created through one of those techniques we just talked about, how do you go about testing messages? Again, there's a lot of different approaches to doing this. We're going to talk about a few of the more common ones here, but again, there are others. But obviously, you can explore messages through qualitative research. You can test them quantitatively, and we'll talk about a number of different approaches here. So qualitative exploration is trying to understand what a message means. So less about which message is the best. What does the message mean when you hear it? What a message makes the viewer think about, what in their associative network, when they hear this message, what does it connect to in their mind? What about the message resonates or doesn't? What about it works or doesn't work? What could make it more impactful? In what ways the message fits with the brand's image or doesn't fit with the brand's image or the viewer's experience with the product? What about the message might not be believable, credible, like I just said, their experience with the product might not be understood, or importantly for each of those, why that is the case. Sometimes in qualitative, you'll use highlighter tool exercises that for the participants to say, hey, here's what I like, here's what I don't like, here's what's confusing to me. They'll highlight different phrases of a message to help us understand and track what's helpful or not. On the testing side, this is when we have messages and we're trying to, again, pick winners and losers, right? So line testing is quantitative surveys trying to test each message line, right? And this is how well consumers react to a number of different messages. Could be 3, 5, 10. I've seen 40 being tested. And we're trying to select the winners. Which ones hold the most promise? Which ones could be tweaked to be more promising? And which ones just aren't resonating with people at all? And we'll look at maybe which message is most likely to drive an action, or generate a purchase, or visit a website, or get people to find out more or talk to their doctor, right? Again, which messages are most credible, clear, fit with the brand image, or unique, or differentiating, or motivating. A couple of things to think about when you're setting up a test like this. Messages are usually brief, 1 or 2 lines, right? If you have 4-paragraph messages and you've got 12 of them, that's probably going to require a different type of test than just doing line testing. Line testing is, 1 or 2 lines of text. And you have to think about how many messages can one consumer assess in a test. Again, I've had some where there are 40 messages. Do you really want a consumer going through and assessing 40 different messages, right? There's consumer fatigue. Consumers start comparing them. In the consumer's mind, they all start sounding the same to them. So maybe you want to randomly assign a reasonable amount of lines to test. Depends how long they are. 10 of them, 15 of them, perhaps, is a reasonable number. So just something to think about. TURF, otherwise known as totally unduplicated reach and frequency, is trying to understand how a combination of different messages work together to tell one story. Or we've recently used it to tell what's the best order to expose these messages in market. So we had a campaign where there were 4 films that were already shot and ready to go, 30-second, 60-second ads. And the question was, which one of these ads do we lead with? What's the best second one, right? And the way you think about unduplicated reach and frequency in this context is when people see the first ad, what percent of people are likely to take an action? Then when they see the second ad, how much incremental action do you get, right? So you're trying to kind of set up the order of these messages so the first one gets the most people to notice it and react to it. The second one adds a bunch to it, right? If you find that after the first one, ad B adds no additional people and does nothing more, then maybe you deprioritize ad B in the media mix. Yeah. Some considerations about using TURF. Again, all messages have to fit within the brand's image and the campaign big idea. Messages, again, are usually brief, although like I said, we recently did it with some films. And you usually need to select one key metric or KPI with which to measure the messages. So that could be purchase likelihood to click on a website, go to a website, something like that. TURF can be a little artificial because consumers don't see the different messages together. They sort of see them separate, and you're building the story of how they work together. So it is slightly artificial, but in my experience working with this, the results of it actually work pretty well. Conjoint and MaxDiff are similar. So these are 2 choice test methodologies, meaning if you haven't worked with either of these methodologies, they present consumers with a number of different choices in an array, right? So, if we were looking at building a product and we were looking at cost and durability and package size, whatever, what different options of those make the optimal design? You can do that with messages as well. MaxDiff is similar. So again, this is how to construct a message by measuring the appeal of individual components of that message in order to yield one most impactful message. So here's a bunch of components. Which ones should we have included in it? And which ones should we exclude? Which ones should we prioritize? Which ones should we deprioritize? So that when you put them together, it's a very impactful message. So like this second bullet says here, what's the utility of the individual components of a message and how do they work best when assembled together? Again, like with TURF, you need to select one metric that you're going to judge it by, purchase likelihood. And like TURF, it can be a little artificial, right? Because you're not really showing consumers a fully baked message with or without components. You're sort of building it from the ground up, right? It would be like showing people one piece of Lego, then another piece of Lego, then another piece, but you never show them the finished thing that those Legos make. So it can be a little artificial, but again, there's a lot of value in running a test like this. We've talked about this before, and you've seen it perhaps, you saw it in foundations, but biometrics and psychometrics, how a message engenders a subconscious, unconscious, nonverbal response in consumers by measuring unconscious cognitive processing, heart rate, respiration, eye movement, skin response, and different physiological responses suggest messages are being processed in different ways. Some notes about this: it's often conducted in conjunction with more traditional, quote unquote, survey research, question and answer type thing. It does require a skilled specialist to execute and interpret the results of these types of studies. And it's usually used in selecting what's the winning message, rather than trying to explain why certain messages won, although that is a component of this as well. A/B testing, we've talked about a bit, right? This is trying to understand how well two or more different messages are performing in the real world, most often a digital environment. The messages are put into market live, and the one that drives the most engagement or clicks is the winner, right? And this allows for testing of numerous variations of copy, images, colors, fonts, buttons, whatever we're trying to do, right? The notes and considerations about it is it's generally quick and easy to deploy these. It's real world. So this is going to be how it's going to be, because we put this out in the wild. It's a great tool for telling you what message wins, but its one shortcoming is that it may not always tell you why. And you may need to marry like an A/B test with a little qualitative research to understand, this message won, but why did it win? Yeah. So those sort of the top most often used message testing approaches. Let's talk about reasons to believe a bit, RTBs. And RTB is the proof or the reason why consumers should trust a brand promise or some other appeal. Similar to testing the message, these methods can also be used to test RTBs, right? So an example message is Pizza Hut's "No one out pizzas the Hut," right? But an example of a reason to believe that no one out pizzas the Hut may be more people order from Pizza Hut than any other pizza place or pizza store. There are more varieties of toppings than anyone else, or we are the original pan pizza, or we're the cheapest, whatever your reason to believe is. Reasons to believe can be a lot of different things, right? They could be testimonials. So someone trusted saying these are the best, or this is my favorite, or whatever, or some kind of endorsement from a person or a body. In pharma, clinical trial results, obviously, or even test results outside of pharma, right? Trident for years, 4 out of 5 dentists prefer Trident or would recommend Trident. Research results. Their experience in a category, their sales ranking, we're #1 in the US. More people prefer our product over others based on some type of trial, right? So reasons to believe. When you're testing messages, what should the stimuli be, right? It can vary. It can be just like we've been talking about a bit, 1 line or 2 lines of copy. It could be images and copy, the words locked up together. It could be a concept like stimuli, what we would call an adcept, which is generally words describing what the campaign or message might be, or a more ad-like object, what we call ad lobs, right? It looks more like an ad with the message in there. Here's a couple things to consider. The further your stimuli appears from what an actual ad might look like, the more consumers can be challenged in understanding how to assess it, regardless of what caveats the researcher gives. Often, if we're doing that and it's like a manifesto or a statement of a message, researchers will say to people, this is not an ad. This is not a finished ad. So this could become an ad, but don't read it like it's an ad. Consumers struggle with that because in their world, they've only ever seen ads. They've never seen manifestos or components of what might become an ad. So they don't quite know how to read it and how to assess it. So my advice has always been, the closer you can get to an ad-like object, the more likely it is that you're going to have consumers qualified to be able to respond to you and give you some value in the questions you ask. Messages that are presented out of context. It's just the copy. There's no imagery. There's no brand name. So just words can make the exercise of testing that a little more rational, a little more left-brainy, right? Conscious, rational thinking. And thereby it removes any evaluation of more emotional evaluations or components of it, right? Again, the more ad-like it is, the more real it's going to be in the marketplace. Another thing to think about is sometimes the people who are deeply involved in the creation of messages, agencies, clients, even research people, see differences between alternate messages as being more significant differences than consumers see, right? So we look at it and say, oh, wow, you know, these message A and message B are very different. But when you show them to consumers, that difference is so subtle that to them, they're saying the same thing. So be careful about what we call dancing on the head of a pin, you know, and thinking that this subtle difference in wording is going to be meaningful to a consumer. How do you expose stimuli when you're testing it in research? It's a number of different ways, right? So monadic is one you've probably heard about, where each respondent or participant is exposed to one and only one stimulus. Simultaneously, respondents see a number of them, all exposed at the same time, assessing each one as a list. Here's message one, here's message two. Tell me which one you prefer most. How would you rate all of these on a scale of really makes me want to find out more to doesn't do anything to me, right? And usually when you're testing those messages, it's again 1 line or 2 lines. Sequential monadic, 2 or more stimuli are exposed and each one is evaluated on their own. So let's look at stimuli 1 and let's ask you a few questions about that. Great. Now let's look at stimuli of message 2. Ask you a few questions. Great. Now let's look at number 3, right, et cetera. And we rotate or randomize the order of those. Proto-monadic is a sequential monadic, like I just described, but at the end there's a comparison. Okay, we talked about message 1, we talked about message 2. Now we want to put them head to head. You know, which one of these two, when you look at both of these, is more likely to make you find out more likely to make you try it, et cetera, et cetera. There's always arguments about what's the best approach here, right? Do you do monadic or do you do sequential monadic or some version of that like proto-monadic? The arguments for doing monadic design is it's sort of the gold standard because the isolated feedback of just one testing, just one message or one concept simulates a more realistic consumer experience, right? Consumers are not going to see 3 different brand messages for a product and market. They're going to see one, right? So this more realistically reflects that reality. It reduces bias because there is a tendency for all people, but consumers as well, to make comparisons across messages, right? How much do I like this message? Well, compared to the last one, I like it a lot better. Or compared to the last one, this one's more interesting, right? So that always creates problems. And when you do it monadically, you have the ability to dig deeper, ask a whole lot more questions about it, and there's less respondent fatigue. The argument against monadic is that cost and timing are increased, because if you have 4, 5, 6 messages and you're doing it monadically, everyone sees one, you need a cell of people for each one of those. So it becomes more expensive and more time consuming. The arguments for sequential monadic, or one of those variants, the results are relative rather than absolute. So we are forcing a choice, right? We're exposing them to numerous ones and saying, okay, now which would you like better, A or B, B or D? And it gives us, it makes it easier to pull apart the answers. Yeah. You can use smaller sample sizes, which save costs. The arguments against sequential monadic is that with multiple stimuli to test, there's less time to gain deeper insights on each one. Now, with that said, both of these methods are used frequently in testing everything in research, including messages. One thing I have observed is that when you're doing monadic testing, and to some degree with sequential monadic, this gets back to the other point of, marketers see more differences between stimuli than maybe consumers do. But sometimes, unless the messages or whatever you're testing are really, 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 really different from each other, when you get your results back monadically, there's not much difference between them. It's difficult to see and pick the winner because all the numbers are so close to each other. Whereas sequential monadic, you're almost forcing people to pick. And when you do that, the messages or the stimuli tend to pull apart a little bit more dramatically. Norms and normative data. Message test results in isolation can be helpful. Hey, we tested this message and 60% of people said it would be likely to make them buy the product. That can be helpful, though they're more powerful when you compare it to something, whether you're comparing it to another message or a normative data, right? Normative data are data that are collected by the client or research companies, averaged, and then they compare your data to that data, right? So when you can look at the data by normative data and cut that normative database so it reflects either your audience, your category, your brand, maybe even your previous messages, it can give you a sense of, okay, so this may have performed best among all the messages we tested, but how did it perform against how other messages have performed in the past, right? That can be very helpful. A couple other considerations, and we've talked about this already in this course. When testing messages, it's important to consider how consistent messaging is across marketer-owned properties and consumer touch points, right? So if this is the winning message, how can that message easily be translated across video, digital, billboards, print, etc.? How different messages will appear to consumers at those different touch points in store? And even though multiple messages may score highly in testing, advertisements are best served by being as single-minded as possible, which this chart on the right shows. Some other considerations to think about. Marketing thought leaders often talk about presenting consumers with the right message at the right time. Well, from a research perspective, does that suggest that message testing should be conducted with consumers at varying stages along the journey, right? If I'm in the active consideration phase, or in this picture, active evaluation stage, am I going to judge messages differently than if I'm in the initial brand consideration stage? It's interesting. I've seen some work done on that, but interesting to think about. If a message is new, it's important to understand how well the new message jibes with the consumer's current understanding of the brand. Jerry Zaltman, the guy in the picture here from Harvard, he wrote a really influential book called How Consumers Think. And in there, he discusses this concept of co-creation. Today, co-creation, people have sort of stolen that term to mean brainstorming across stakeholder groups, but that's not what Jerry meant. What Jerry meant when he coined that term was co-creation is, I already have an associative network of your brand in my mind right now. And when I see a new message, what I ultimately internalize as a function of seeing your message is a integration of your new message and what my associative network already knows about your message, right? So if it's a new message, know that if it's a departure from prior messages, people may react negatively to it because it's cognitively dissonant with your associative network for that brand. So just something to keep in mind as you test messages. Obviously, also, when you're testing across markets, or you're going to be using your message across markets, you have to test them across markets, because what may resonate in one market may not resonate in another. When you are doing B2B, business to business marketing, the testing of messages has to be conscious that often the buyer of B2B services may not be the user of B2B services, right? So you may have to survey multiple audiences in that case. Let's talk about claims a bit. Claims is sort of a subset of messages, but they're pretty different. So a claim is a statement made in advertising about the benefits, characteristics, or performance of a product or service. And for advertising purposes, there's sort of two broad types of claims. Claims of fact that assert something quantifiable. The Tesla Model 3 is the best-selling electric vehicle sedan in the United States, right? That's a statement. Sounds like it's based on sales data somewhere. Or there's claims of value, which assert a qualitative or subjective judgment along a good to bad continuum, right? So Gillette's slogan for years, the best a man can get, right? So two very broad different types of claims. Claims and claims research are kind of serious business, right? Claims can have a legal or regulatory implication, especially in highly regulated categories such as food, finance, healthcare, maybe even some aspects of automotive. And companies can face legal fees, penalties, fines, marketplace restrictions if their claims do not meet the rules and regulations intended to protect consumers. Compliance is a serious matter and is enforced by a variety of authorities and venues: National Advertising Division of the Better Business Bureau, federal courts, and government agencies like the FDA and the FTC. Normally in an organization, large organizations that are regulated and are looking to test claims will have an internal counsel, legal attorney, working with you on assessing and developing claims. Although requirements vary, FDA and FTC generally aim to assure that the claims companies make to their customers can reasonably be expected to be true. And the key word here is reasonably. right? In 1984, the FTC kind of defined what reasonable means. Marketers must have a basis for substantiation before making a claim. They just can't say it. They have to have some evidence that that is true. And the evidence for the basis must be reasonable when we think about the type of claim, the risk to the consumer of a false claim, and the cost of developing substantiation. And there's other factors as well, right? Some claims may be easier to substantiate, sales data. Some may be much less easy. Some claims may be more likely to invoke a competitor's lawsuit or reaction, and others less likely to be. In advertising, there's a concept around claims called puffery, and it's kind of a gray area of claims. In legalese, puffery refers to an expression of opinion by a seller that isn't made as a representation of fact, right? So it may be a salesperson's exaggeration about a product quality that really a reasonable person wouldn't expect it to be seen as a claim, right? So, hey, we're the best at this. Does feel subjective and maybe even a little exaggerated, but people would not mistake it as a defendable claim, right? And puffery is distinguished from outright misrepresentation in that, like I said, a reasonable person wouldn't mistake it as a supported claim. Yeah. Going back to Pizza Hut from before, the slogan of Papa John's, better ingredients, better pizza. Is that a claim or is that puffery? They were sued by Pizza Hut in 1997, claiming that Papa John's couldn't prove that they had either better ingredients nor better pizza. Papa John's initially lost the suit, but then it was reversed on appeal as the courts determined that what constituted better was dependent on personal opinion, not objective fact, and therefore the slogan was considered puffery. When researching claims, while in general it's similar to researching messages, just know that claims research is going to have to stand up to greater scrutiny and perhaps in a court of law. Therefore, greater care has to be considered on all aspects of the research, design, and execution, such as a well-constructed, solid, and defensible methodological and sample design, analyzing results at a high level of statistical confidence, and adhering to all research design best practices of questionnaire design and data collection, because if this ends up in court, the opposing attorney is certainly going to try and poke holes in the research that you did to substantiate that claim. So it would be good thinking about this as you're designing it. What could the potential flaws in this methodology be? Right? It's prudent, as I said, to include representatives of marketing, insights, and the legal department when researching claims. And there are research firms that specialize in claims research, including providing representation to any future litigation. Contracts, this is important to know, between marketers and ad agencies often prohibit agencies from using agency-conducted research for claims substantiation. So I've experienced this where we had done some initial research and came up with an idea about claims, but because of this contract with our client, we then had to repeat that study with a third-party research firm to substantiate our claims so that the claims could be used in advertising. Comparative messages and claims, another subset of messaging. Comparative advertising is an ad strategy in which a brand compares itself to a competitor to highlight parity or superiority or how poor the competitor is. The FTC, Federal Trade Commission, states that comparative advertising is beneficial to consumers when it's truthful and non-deceptive because it's a source of important information that assists them in making good decisions and can lead to lower prices in the marketplace. Arguments for doing comparative advertising is that they tend to be hard-hitting, they can be aggressive and get attention, and clearly position the number 2 player in a market or the number 3 or number 4 versus the category leader. They stand out because they can be bold, powerful, and a bit daring. And they give consumers concrete choice, reasons for choosing one over another. But there are, of course, arguments against comparative advertising. The marketer who's doing the comparison runs the risk of creating confusion between the brands. Wait a minute, which one was the more expensive and which, right? People don't recall it. Or if the competitor responds in some way and calls out a different comparison within which they are superior, the two efforts can cancel each other out. You are, in some cases, giving free exposure to a competitor in the ad, right? If you look at both of these on this slide, Ashley Furniture versus Value City, Burger King versus McDonald's, you're mentioning the competitor in your ad, right? Sometimes disparaging a competitor in this way can be seen as unsportsmanlike or unfair. And it can make the challenger, in some cases, look desperate. Wow, look at that. They're going after so-and-so. What does that say, right? It can be viewed as misleading, which promotes consumer skepticism, opens the door to court challenges, right? If you call out a competitor, you should expect that they will respond either in market or in court or some other way. Since the ads in comparative advertising tend to argue function, brand equity can suffer because you're not talking about what the brand's all about. You're talking at a very functional level. With social media, consumers can now insert themselves into that comparative debate that may or may not work in your favor. Product comparison sites and review sites and consumer trade publications will quickly expose shaky claims and maybe do it harshly as well. And even though the US allows this, only a few global markets allow comparative advertising. It changes a bit over the years, but it's mainly maybe a handful that allow comparative advertising. US is one of them. So there are different types of comparative advertising. Brands can compare themselves on parity, where as good as the competitor, or often the way that's stated is nobody works better than us, nobody is faster than us, nobody tastes as good as us. Those are parity claims, but even though they sound like superiority claims, superiority is we're better than our competitor. We do this better, we do it faster, we do it smarter, we do it whatever. Or superlative, we're the best in the market. Nobody does what we do. We are the best, right? And here are some examples on the right here you can read through. Some things to think about when you're doing comparative advertising. Categories where the consumer choice is based more on taste or individual preference, those tend to be ones where comparative ads are less effective. Categories where consumer choice is more rational rather than emotional, like we were talking about on the last slide, the elements of it tend to be more effective. Well-established categories that have a few category leaders tend to use comparative advertising more than fragmented categories where there are 2, 3, 4, 10 dozens of players. And there are some rules of thumb for comparative advertising, right? The product must have a unique advantage, and that unique advantage must address a consumer need. It's good to use both visual and audio in the execution. And this is, again, to try and avoid consumer confusion as to which one is claiming the superiority. Claims, of course, have to be defensible. Credible sources improve effectiveness. So, if it's Car and Driver magazine rates our car as #1 versus the competitor at #3. Well, Car and Driver is a credible source, so that helps. It is strategically smarter to compare to the guy in front of you rather than the guy behind you, right? So it feels unleader-like for the #1 brand to attack a challenger, and it gives the challenger too much credit. So it's usually the challenger attacking the category leader. You need a proper balance in the ad between presentation of your brand, which should be most of the time, versus the competitor, should be short, again, about giving too much airtime to the competitor. The execution should not be mean-spirited, and a clear distinction between the positionings is essential. Here's some learnings from copy testing companies, pre-testing companies, which we'll talk more about later in the course, about comparative ads. Comparative ads, especially those that are accompanied with a new or improved message, tend to be better than comparative ads at breaking through and impacting purchase behavior. The efficacy of comparative ads is similar regardless of which video length you're looking at, 6 seconds, 15, 30, 1 minute, doesn't really matter. The level of brand loyalty of a particular consumer in a category has a large impact on the ability of comparative ads to change a person's behavior. We see this in politics too. People who are extremely loyal on the far fringes of the left or the far fringes of the right, comparative advertising is unlikely to have a big effect on those people. Comparative advertising is more likely to have an effect on people in the middle who haven't formed a loyalty one way or the other. Without new or improved messaging, comparative ads in general do no better or no worse than ads that don't mention a competitor. Okay, so that's where we are on messages and claims. I hope that was useful. Be well, everyone. See you soon. Bye-bye.